It's the night of February 24, 1989. High above the dark expanse of the Pacific Ocean, an unimaginable crisis is unfolding. On board United Airlines Flight 811, a Boeing 747 carrying over 350 passengers and crew, an enormous explosion tears through the aircraft's side. A gaping hole opens up, and the oxygen masks deploy, but they're useless. No one, not even the pilots, can use them. With fire erupting from the engines and the aircraft struggling to stay aloft, the captain's only option is to dive towards the ocean, hoping to reach an altitude where breathable air still exists. But the crisis doesn't end there. In the cabin, 9 passengers are missing, and more critical systems are failing. By the second, the crew has to perform a delicate, life or death balancing act to try and get their crippled jumbo jet back to safety. This is the harrowing story of United Airlines Flight 811 and the battle for survival in the face of an unimaginable disaster. The passengers on board United Airlines Flight 811 were preparing for a long journey. At 1:30 a.m., 337 passengers and 18 crew members boarded the Boeing 747 at Honolulu International Airport in Hawaii. Their destination, Auckland, New Zealand, a 9-hour flight across the Pacific Ocean. The aircraft had been with United Airlines for nearly 2 decades, dating back to 1970, and though it had served its purpose well, it was showing signs of age. With older engines and analog dials in the cockpit, the plane was far from the cutting-edge technology of newer jets. Yet, nothing on the ground could prepare them for the nightmare awaiting them at 22,000 feet. Meet the Crew. Flight crew was led by Captain David Cronin, one of United's most seasoned pilots. With 28,000 flight hours under his belt, Captain Cronin had seen nearly everything the skies could throw at him. But this night, his experience would be put to the ultimate test. At 59, Cronin was just 1 flight away from retirement, with Flight 811 scheduled to be his penultimate flight. Alongside him was First Officer Gregory Slater, a 48-year-old veteran with 14,500 flight hours. Together, they had flown for more than 20 years, facing challenges both in the air and on the ground. Behind them was 46-year-old flight engineer Randall Thomas, who had amassed over 20,000 hours of flying experience. But tonight, he would be the first to realize the full extent of the disaster unfolding around them. The disaster strikes. The flight began without incident. Passengers settled in, and the plane began its climb into the night sky. But just 17 minutes after takeoff, as the aircraft climbed through 22,000 feet, an explosive thump shook the plane. A deafening explosion followed, sending shockwaves throughout the aircraft. The lights flickered, alarms blared, and an overwhelming force tore through the fuselage. For a brief moment, everyone feared the worst. A bomb had gone off, a scenario that had haunted the skies since the Lockerbie bombing just 2 months earlier. But the crew quickly realized that something far worse had occurred. The pressure had rapidly dropped, and the air inside the cabin had been sucked out. Rapid descent and engine failure. At this altitude, there wasn't enough oxygen to keep anyone conscious for long. The captain began a desperate dive, hoping to reach a lower, safer altitude before everyone passed out. But as they descended, the aircraft was shaking violently and warnings flashed in the cockpit. "Looks like we've lost engine number 3, the first officer reported, trying to process the chaos. One engine had failed, and soon, engine number 4 was showing signs of distress. With fire erupting from engine number 4, the crew knew their options were running out. Flying a fully loaded 747 with only 2 functioning engines, they were descending too quickly to stay aloft. The situation was dire, and the crew had no choice but to attempt an emergency return to Honolulu. The plight of the passengers back in the cabin. The situation was even worse. A massive section of the right side of the fuselage had been ripped away, and 9 passengers had been ejected from the plane. The remaining passengers could hear nothing but the howling wind and the deafening roar of the engines. Flight attendants scrambled to administer oxygen to the remaining passengers, but many were struggling to breathe as hypoxia set in. One flight attendant, nearly sucked out of the plane, was clinging to her seat for dear life. Her colleagues had to pull her back inside, but she had been severely injured in the process. Meanwhile, in the cockpit, the pilots were facing a growing number of issues. With both engines on the right side failing, the plane began veering sharply to the right. Fuel dump and a dying engine with only 2 working engines. The crew's only hope of reaching Honolulu was to dump fuel and lighten the load. As they desperately attempted to burn off weight, engine number 4 suddenly caught fire. Massive flames shot out the back, and the aircraft began to fall even faster. The crew shut down the flaming engine, but they were still flying a heavily damaged aircraft, now more than 100 kilometers from Honolulu. The plane was too heavy to maintain altitude, and with the damaged engines, they weren't able to generate enough power to stay in the air. As the plane descended, the pilots fought to keep the aircraft level. The plane continued to veer right, and the pilots had to fight the rudder with everything they had just to keep it in line. At this point, the crew had no idea if they would even make it back to land. The chance of ditching in the dark ocean seemed like the only option. The final struggle with the plane dropping faster and faster, it seemed impossible for the crew to maintain any control. The remaining passengers, many of whom had no idea what was happening behind the scenes, were left clinging to hope. In the cockpit, the crew's experience, teamwork, and quick thinking were the only things that stood between the lives of 350 souls and the vast ocean below. The countdown to disaster seemed inevitable, but against all odds, Captain Cronin and his crew fought their way through the crisis. They faced down fire, engine failure, rapidly depleting fuel, and catastrophic structural damage, all while struggling to keep the aircraft in the air. In a miraculous turn of events, the pilots managed to bring the crippled 747 to a safe emergency landing at Honolulu, despite all odds. It was a flight that would become a testament to the indomitable human spirit and the power of training, experience, and teamwork under the most harrowing of circumstances. A life-or-death gamble that began as a routine flight had turned into an unimaginable fight for survival. United Airlines Flight 811 became a symbol of the worst-case scenario in aviation, and the crew's heroic actions saved hundreds of lives. This is a story of what happens when the unexpected becomes reality, when every second counts, and when every decision can be the difference between life and death. The legacy of United Airlines Flight 811 is one of courage, determination, and the unbreakable will to survive.